Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today with a project update video for this 1/6 scale Armortek radio-controlled Russian T34 85 medium tank. Since the last video update, a lot of progress has been made to the tank's turret, where specifically I went ahead and completed both the modification and redetailing of the mantlet, as well as the installation of the mantlet components, the elevation system, as well as, yes, even the main gun and the barrel recoil system. We'll be going over all of this information in this video, so stay tuned because there's going to be a bunch of content coming right at you. Moving on to the parts that are going to be fitted to the vehicle in this video, we have here a good smattering of them on the table. A lot of these parts are going to be very similar to anyone who's seen the other 1/6 scale Armortek build videos that I've done, because basically the system is wash, rinse, and repeat. Also, a few of these pieces here, namely some of the mantle parts, I believe I discussed in the last T34 video, but with that out of the way, let's go ahead and dig into what we see here on the table. And what's seen on the table are not just the parts for the main mantlet and the main tube itself, but we have here the elevation and the recoil system. Going over the biggest parts first takes us to the mantlet and the forward section of the mantlet. This, I believe I touched upon in the last video. Basically, they're comprised of CNC turnings and do have the appropriate shape and size dimensions for the T34 85 mantlet. There are some revisions. I am going to be making this, but we'll be going over that as the video progresses. Moving further takes us to this Cnc Bushing. It's made out of brass, and I've seen this type of equipment utilized in several other Armortek kits of the past. Some kits tend to have a brass bushing like this, and while others tend to use nylon. As for which one gets used on which kit, well, that really depends on the kit in question. Of course, the largest thing on the table is the main tube. This here is for the 85mm version of the T34. Of course, if this was the 76 version, it would have the shorter 76mm barrel. Just like with all Armortek kits, this piece is comprised of a single turning of CNC'd aluminum. It is pre-threaded in the rear portion, and the barrel does appear to be correct to 1/6 scale. Carry on, we have these two sections here of CNC'd brass, as well as CNC'd steel lugs. If anyone's watched the King Tiger video that I recently published, this should look very familiar because it's basically the exact same type of components. These pieces here are going to secure the mantlet to the front trunnion of the turret, and then these portions here are the rotation lugs, which will keep everything in place and will allow the 85mm to elevate or depress. Just like with the King Tiger build, the rear portion that connects to the recoil system is comprised of a single piece of CNC brass. Only, unlike the other kits where this piece was a hexagonal type shape, this one here, it's just a cylinder. Not sure if this is because of the age of the kit. Remember, this is from 2011, and the other kits came out later, and they probably made the geometry change just so it's easier to get a wrench around them. But either way, this component here functions and assembles in the exact same manner. There is a notch cut into here in order for the photo strobe, which is in this baggie over here, wire to come through and patch into the remainder of the RC system. While on that note, here goes the photo strobe loom. It's basically a cluster of bright LEDs on a long piece of wire with some quick connects on the end, and this will of course plug into the circuitry that's supplied with the kit in order to give you that flash when the system is triggered. Also, what was discussed in the other videos, here we have the main linkage arm as well as a aluminum servo arm that we have here. These two components are what are going to connect that brass turning to the servo and are going to actuate the recoil system when it's functional. And of course, that is going to be facilitated by this Savix, whatever type of servo. This is a very high quality servo. It's made all out of metal, and I believe it might be ball bearing assisted as well. These, for a while, came stock with the Armortek kits. However, it's important to note that in recent history, I believe Armortek have revised their recoil system, and this is something that's not utilized anymore. But if you encounter one of these older kits in the wild, chances are really good they have the Savo system that are supplied with the kits, or possibly, depending on the condition the model's in, it's probably already pre-installed. Continuing on further takes us to the remainder of the pieces, and these are straight up standard rinse, wash, and repeat from the Armortek motion pack system. We have here a geared motor that's pre-wired up, and basically just plug and plays into the Armortek system. In order to facilitate the actual elevation and depression, we have this CNC steel gear system. Same one that's been utilized on many other builds that have already been discussed on this channel, along with the camming bracket, which again is made from laser cut steel. It's pre-cut and bent to shape. And in order to actually actuate everything, we have the lugs themselves. These are CNC brass. This one here is threaded and will ride up and down that camshaft that I'm most certainly going to show as the video goes on. This here is the locking plate and keeps everything in place. While on that note, here goes another standard Armortek piece. This here is the recoil system mounting bracket. It's basically a single piece of laser cut steel. This is going to secure to the back end of the mantlet, and you can see it has the provisions for mounting on the servo that I touched upon before. Again, if anyone watched my other Armortek videos, this piece here should be very familiar. Of course, we have a bag of assorted fasteners of one flavor or another. These are all going to be utilized to assemble all the parts on the table that I just shown. But one thing here that's unique for the T34, and something that I haven't seen on the other builds, is this bracket that we have over here. Not really sure how this bracket works or where it goes, but I'm pretty sure we're going to figure this out as this video progresses. But what it appears to be is that this is the motor mount for the elevation motor that I touched upon before. Just like with the other brackets, it's made from a single piece of laser cut steel plate. The thickness is about 1/8 of an inch, if not a little bit thicker, which is really good because it gives you some nice strength and it will prevent the piece from bending due to the weight of the system that needs to elevate in the press. Probably the biggest revision that I'm going to be making to the tank at this time is going to be revolving the mantlet. Just like in the last video where I had to revise the turret, making it more, shall we say, Russian in its appearance, the same is also true for the mantlet itself. The mantlet does give you the basic bare bones shape and look of the T34-85 mantlet, but, you know, there's a room for a little bit of improvement. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go ahead and add, or I should say mill away more material on these two areas that we have right here and here. On the real T34-85 turret, it's done basically in the same way. They just take the casted section and they mill away, adding these two slots that are found in these sections. The Armortek kit does do this, however, in my opinion, they're a little bit on the thinner end, and in order to improve it, I'm just going to go ahead and widen them out a little bit. From several examples I've seen of the real one, this middle section here seems to be a little bit more narrower in its appearance compared to the stock version, so I'm just going to go ahead and create this by removing a little bit more material. Along with the material removal from these sections, I'm also going to go ahead and add wells to these 4 areas that we see here, and on the real one, these were for the housing of fasteners, which are still going to be added to the model, and with the combination of both adding the wells and widening these sections off, the fasteners should fit on better compared to the condition that we see here on the stock unit. To do this, obviously, this is going to be done with my vertical mill, and needless to say, if you do not have a mill for this procedure, this is something that you're definitely not going to be for you, and you might just want to sit this one out. With the milling out of the way, the next thing I need to address is the assembly of the mantlet itself. The way this kit is designed is that you have the brass bushing, it slides into this little cavity inside the boss here, and then the thing gets adhered to the mantlet and you're good to go. One thing I do want to point out is exactly how excellent the machining is on this brass bushing. In the past, on both materials of bushing, either be brass or nylon, depending on the tank in question, I generally need to do some hand fitting on some of the tolerances on these components. However, if we take the tube that we have here, you'll see it's absolutely perfect. I mean, this is, I don't see there being any problems whatsoever with the assembly on this one. So with that in mind, I could go ahead and just assemble the unit out of the box with really no problems in that regard. Both the bushing as well as the boss itself are adhered to the mantlet with adhesives, and really no more, no less. With the bushing added, the entire piece is then mounted in place. I also went ahead and made some more revisions to the piece, namely the wells that I touched upon before, but you'll also see that I changed the curvature here found on the front portion of the mantlet. This was done freehand on the belt sander, and normally this would be verboten and would be something that's frowned upon, but again, T34, it's a totally different ballgame. At this point here, just like with the turret, this is now the basis to add the texturing and the sculpted epoxy in order to really make this piece enhanced and to really give it that look and feel that would be found on the real T34 85 mantlet. So from here I'm going to go ahead and take some sculptable epoxy, add it to the appropriate locations, and then go ahead and give it a nice once over with the cast texturing to really seal the look. Bouncing back to the turret, before I can go ahead and mount the mantlet on, I'm going to paint the entire outer portion of the turret with a coat of red primer. Before I went ahead and did that, I bounced back to this section over here where I deleted the fastener location holes. Of course, with the way the unit is assembled, you do have these two very large Allen fasteners that are used to secure the front portion here of the trunnion to the remainder of the turret. Well, even though the mantlet is in this section over here and these fastener locations are not that visible, it's one of those things where I just want to cover all bases, so I went ahead and plugged them up and blended them in with my usual format. And here's the mantlet with the revisions completed. As you can see, it looks very different compared to its original out-of-the-box offering, where that unit had mostly 90-degree bends on several of the components, while on the real T34, the unit, since it was all cast, would have had more of a rounded, blunt type outward appearance to it. This was achieved by using sculptable epoxy. A lot of people ask what's the material that I use. My stuff is actually a industrial epoxy, and as for what it is exactly, well, that's a trade secret. I'm not going to go into that, but most people use Milliput or A's epoxy sculpt, and that is a material that will get you basically the same result as I have here. That's used to give the rounded edges on some of the surfaces, as well as also to build up these areas over here where we have these half-moon cutouts that are found on the barrel extension. For the texturing itself, once the epoxy was fully set and cured, I went ahead and encased everything with the same rough cast texturing that was showcased on the turret video, which came out prior to this one here. The results are also exactly the same. While on some of the details, you can see the fasteners have been added. These ones here are spare ones that I had on hand. I don't believe the Armortek T34 kit gives you these fasteners in order to give you these details. I believe they just want you to use your standard hex bolts, but on the real T34, they would have been conical like these ones here. If anyone has seen the other video that I recently published about the King Tiger project that I have going, on that mantlet, it has details very similar to this, and I explain some of the reasons why the Germans utilize the acorn fasteners for this, and it's basically the same reasons on the T34. Basically, this will give a little bit of protection to the fastener from oncoming rounds, and it can actually deflect a round or two, which will prevent damage from the bolt, which, if you need to remove it, it does make the job a little bit easier. So, these bolts here are actually from Armortek, but again, these were spare ones that I had in my spare inventory. So, I just went ahead and just mounted them in the locations which were originally drilled out on the Armortek kit, but like I showcased before, I went ahead and modified them by adding wells, and I also went ahead and built up these areas here where there would be a flat section in order to have more material for the fastener to adhere to. On the Armortek kit, these are missing, but again, this is something that gets sculpted with the epoxy that I touched upon before. Well, from here, I'm actually going to go ahead and get this thing into primer so that I can continue with the remainder of the installation. Prior to doing that, of course, I am going to mask up thoroughly the inside portion here because you do not want any sort of paint getting on the bushing or the other areas of the internal sections of the mantlet or the barrel extension, which of course will hinder the barrel with its recoil animation. So, go ahead, get all that masked up, get this bad boy into prime, and then we can then continue with the remainder of the install. With the mantlet now fully primed, at this point here, the turret can go into its assembly. So right now on the inside, I have the elevation motor secured to the bracket, and that is mounted to the turret base. I'm going to bring the camera in closer just so you get a good idea of what it looks like. And here you can see how the motor and the motor mount are secured to the turret. It's a very simple install. The motor secures via these 4 fasteners. All these are kit supplied, and then 3 more larger fasteners are used to secure the plate to the turret itself. However, one change I made from the original kit is that the kit, like I stated before, does give you the fasteners, and here they are in this bag right over here. The supply fasteners are M4 by 6 millimeters, and this will be able to secure everything in place. However, I felt that the short stubby length of these fasteners here is something that I could improve upon. The turret itself does have sufficient threads drilled into the piece, and it's tapped, so you can utilize a longer fastener. The reason why I wanted to opt for the longer fasteners is I feel that with the amount of torque and pressure that this piece is on, with the added length of the bolt with the threads, it should give more material there, which will lend itself for a stronger mounting. Having said that, can you use these fasteners to secure in place? Probably, and I think you should be okay, but just for my own ease of mind, I went ahead and swapped those out with the longer bolts. The longer fasteners just thread directly in place, and no other mods were made whatsoever. And this brings us to the elevation and recoil bracket. If anyone have ever watched my other Armortek build videos, this should look very familiar, but there is a difference found on the T34 kit, and that is you'll see that the recoil bracket and the elevation bracket connect to each other. Generally, this isn't the case on some of the other builds. This bracket over here gets mounted to the inside portion of the mantlet, and that's how the piece will then patch into the motor system. On the T34 here, probably because of the very limited space found on the inside, they went ahead and incorporated into one system. In order to do this, the pieces are separate, but you just secure the bracket to the recoil bracket via two supplied countersunk fasteners. This does the job very well, and just a small little drop of Loctite is really all that was required to get the thing mounted. One thing that I do want to point out, though, is that even though the fasteners are countersunk, there is a slight bit amount of material that emerges from the bottom portion. Nothing too extravagant, but there is a little bit of material there. So after a few bit of wrench turning, here you can see what all the equipment looks like once fitted to the mantlet. What I went ahead and did was with a Dremel, I went ahead and just polished down that little bit of material from those other fasteners that I showed before. With that material removed, I was able to secure the plate to the mantlet in a flush manner. Also, one thing that you'll notice on the bottom fastener here, with a sanding Dremel, I went ahead and carved a little bevel onto this portion. With the way the fastener is designed, it will protrude slightly into this area over here, which is something that you want to avoid in order to, again, to keep this portion nice and clean so that the barrel can recoil without any obstructions. So just by adding a little cut over here, it's a simple way to reduce any sort of friction. It's one of those things that you're going to instantly realize once you assemble everything, and you're going to quickly see, oh, there's a little bit of fastener protruding. The material was simply polished away with the Dremel, and within a few seconds, it was taken care of. On this portion over here, we have the elevating block. And if anyone's seen the other builds on the channel, this system should look very familiar to you. So with this done, I'm now ready to install the unit in place. However, I ran into a very interesting quirk on the T34, and it's one that, well, it's indicative showing that this kit here is really obviously a very limited release, and it's one that was never really fully fleshed out. Let me go ahead and show exactly what I'm talking about. You see, with the way the mantlet is designed to fit into the trunnion, we have these two brass blocks I showed before. They thread into this portion. This gives you your pivot. These systems here have been used on a few other builds, and it works really well. Unfortunately for the T34, I am completely at a loss on how to install them inside of the tight confines. Let me go ahead and bring the camera in so you get a better idea on the predicament that I see here. Well, with the camera readjusted, you can see the inside portion here of the front trunnion. Note the hogged out areas where the brass block here can fit in place. And once in place, you can see how it secures in. Well, the trick is with the pivoting lug. As you can see, I need to install the mantlet, secure the pivoting lugs in place, and then these can secure to the front of the trunnion. Well, it sounds good in theory, but in practice it proves to be, well, rather difficult, if not impossible. Okay, if I take the mantlet and install it, okay, so the mantlet is now in its section, and it's pushed in as far as it will go. Well, the problem is that it's almost impossible to try to get that lug mounted inside that brass block secured into this location. And on the instructions over here, if I zoom out, you can see that they want you to do this prior to the turret being assembled. Well, even with the turret not assembled, you're still going to run into that same problem. The thing is that the mantlet just doesn't go in further enough in order for the fastener sections to clear. So I'm going to have to do some redesigning to both the mantlet as well as also to the securing blocks, just so I could get this thing mounted in place and mounted in place in a functional manner. So in order to get this thing fitted, I am going to have to make some modifications to the pivoting lug sections as well as to the trunnion. Starting with the pivoting lugs, what I'm going to need to do is I'm going to need to alter the shape of the mounting block. Rather than the solid block that we have here, I'm actually going to need to cut it in half so that when it comes time to secure everything in place, it can be done with a two-piece assembly. This should make it easier in order to get the lugs to fit into their appropriate locations and also to get the fasteners in there to keep everything nice and secure. Well, to do this, I'm going to need to mark things with a good, nice precision Sharpie, and then amputate, or I should say cut the sections in half with a very precise cut line on my bandsaw. So to cut the block in half, like I stated before, I was going to originally use the bandsaw. However, when it came time to actually start cutting, the bandsaw was having problems with keeping the line nice and straight. The springiness of the band was causing it to yaw and bend a bit, and it was just leaving for a cut that was less than ideal. So in order to cut this, I'm going to utilize a system that's, well, rather primitive. Basically, I secured the block firmly in my shop vise that I have here, and I'm just going to take none other than a hacksaw and then just manually go over and saw the thing in half. The procedure goes by very well. This is the second one here. I already cut the other one in half, which I'll show later. But it just cuts right through the brass without any problems. The only thing to keep in mind is that you want to first have a really sharp, brand new blade. The original blade that I had on this thing is, well, this thing that I have over here, and obviously this blade here has seen better days, but, you know, I think I put this blade on back in 2008 or so it's seen a lot of cutting. So that blade is done for. Went out to the hardware store, picked up a brand new set, and this is what I've been using so far. So far, so good. The other thing I'm doing is I'm adding just some cutting oil. Again, tap magic, stuff's really good. And just adding some oil to the surface to just keep the blade nice and cool, and also to keep the piece cool as well, which again will preserve the life of the blade. So, I'm just going to go ahead and add a little bit more oil on this bad boy here, and progress with the cutting. When it comes to this procedure, you don't want to go too fast. Slow and steady will win the race. After about like half an inch or so, or a quarter of an inch of cut, just add a little drop of oil, maybe wipe off some of the filings off of the blade, and, you know, you'll be good to go. Also, when I'm cutting this, I'm keeping the blade pressed downward onto the vise itself, which will keep the cut in a nice straight plane and prevent any sort of yawing or bending that can happen. And there we have it. So here's the block sawn in half. When I originally designed this piece, I envisioned that one of these blocks you'll position onto the front portion of the trunnion, and then you apply these two spacers, which will eat up the space that was removed from the actual saw blade. When the top portion gets fastened, it's going to give you the same thickness as it was before. Well, the way originally I intended was that this lug here gets screwed into the trunnion. This gets placed in this portion over here, and then because of the tight confines, it's easier then to just sandwich the unit in place via the two fasteners. And the piece can pivot, and this is much along the lines as you see on the real vehicle. However, after going through all of this, I realized that this was not necessary in any way, shape, or form, because I still cannot get this lug mounted to the trunnion with the given space found on the inside. So I had to go ahead and redesign the unit again. The sections over here are still going to be assembled with the spacers, and that's not going to change. However, the need to saw it in half is not going to be necessary. So basically everything that I just showed now, forget it, ignore it. Other than, you know, appreciating the engineering and the craftsmanship that went into doing this procedure, it's really literally for naught. Where the change needs to be exhibited is actually on the mantlet itself. So in order to get this thing to fit inside of those tight confines on the trunnion, I'm going to basically have to remove altogether these lugs. So these are not going to be needed, and I'm going to need to come up with some sort of a solution in order to get this thing mounted in place. With the way the pieces originally, you have these sections here which are threaded, and like I stated before, you thread them in place, and this is where it gets sandwiched into the block. Well, this isn't going to work because of the tight confines like I mentioned before, so I have to basically redesign how this unit is going to be mounted in place. The design that I came up with, it's thinking a little bit out of the box, but it's one that's relatively easy compared to this sawing nonsense that I just went over and basically, you know, spent a little bit of time figuring out. What I'm going to do is I'm going to have the peg actually emerge from this portion over here, but it's going to be spring bound. To do this, I'm going to need to drill out the threads that we have here, and I already machined a steel lug with the same diameter as the smooth section that we have here on this rod, or I should say on this lug. I'm going to drill this out deeper and also remove the threads so that the peg can move freely in its place. In order to have the piece protrude outward and lock into place, I'm going to sandwich a extension spring, or I should say a compression spring, inside this area here. So basically, I could push the two rods in. This will then allow it to slide into place, and then when it hits the holes found on the block over here, the little pegs pop out and the spring keeps them in place. That's so far probably the best solution for this type of predicament that I found myself in. So, like I stated before, everything that I just showcased, literally forget. I'm going to leave it in the video just for, you know, again, for anyone who appreciates engineering and mechanical type systems like that. Also possibly get ideas for your own builds. But for this build here, it's unnecessary. I'm going to go ahead and redesign this area here of the mantlet. So to do that, the first thing I am going to do is I'm going to drill and bore out these sections deeper. This has to be done on a drill press. I have a brand new drill bit, which is the exact same diameter that I need over here, and I'm going to go ahead and take care of this. The drill press is absolutely required for this because the holes need to be as squared off as possible, and a hand drill can't possibly do the job, but again, like I frequently mention in these videos, a drill press will definitely do a better job of it. So, time to make some chips. So here's the mantlet going through its modification. I already went ahead and drilled out the pilot hole going to the appropriate depth, and now I'm going to be going in with the larger diameter bit here to bore it out to the appropriate diameter of the new lugs that I went ahead and fabricated off screen. One thing to keep in mind about this procedure that you have to really make sure you get right is the depth of the hole. The hole needs to be long enough for clearance of not just the lug, but also for the spring that needs to be held on the inside. If you go too deep, you're going to pop out right here where the barrel is, and then you're not going to be able to get the spring tension required to keep everything in place. Careful measurements were taken, and I went ahead and set the drill press here to the appropriate depth so it can't go ahead and over drill the material. With the mantlet drilled out, I have the new Lug Designs ready for installation. Here we have the original one which came with the kit. I already showed this earlier. And in comparison, you can see here the new design. The new design consists of this cylinder. It's made from a solid chunk of steel. I went ahead and turned it on the lathe to the appropriate diameter, and the diameter is the exact same one found on the original lug. What's different though is with the spring. Basically how this works is I go ahead and put the spring in the now deepened chamber, put the lug in place, and you can see that it sticks up. But when I need to install it into the tank, I could push down on it, and basically the pressure of the spring is going to be putting pressure onto the pin until it hits that sweet spot on the brass lugs, to which then this will pop out and keep it in place. Because the lug is at a sufficient length, the piece is not going to fall out ever, unless you undo the fasteners and remove the brass mounting block. With any luck, this comes out with my lighting, but here you can see the two mounting blocks secured in place, and they are secured with the kit method via the fasteners. I also went ahead and mounted those washers that I mentioned before. So from here, I'm going to go ahead and get the turret right side up and continue with the mantlet mounting procedure. With any luck, this system should work. The lugs have been greased, which will give them a little bit more ease once they slide into their place, and also it should prevent any rust. Okay, so the pins worked exactly as intended. You probably heard them pop into place. And you can see here that the mantlet is not coming off. Right now, I'm adjusting the elevation worm gear here, and then I'm going to apply the set screw. Once that's done, the barrel elevation system is going to be completed. Okay, well, with that fastener now fitted, the motor and elevation unit are fully connected. Like I frequently mention in these videos, the Armortek kit wants you to use a set screw or a grub fastener for this application. However, this is something that I generally don't use on my builds for the reason that grub fasteners, they have a bad habit on stripping out easily as opposed to a standard cap screw like the one that I have here. For some applications on these builds, like for instance on the torsion bars, the grub screws are absolutely required because you need to have the thing as smooth as possible in order for the suspension piece to get fitted in place. For this type of application though, it's not really that important if the piece is flush. With the location of the fastener, there is absolutely nothing that it can make contact with, thus causing any need for it to be surfaceless. The M4 fastener just gets bolted in place, and I went ahead and used blue Loctite on this one because in case for whatever reason the piece or the unit needs to be disassembled, it can be done so with greater ease as opposed to using the red stuff. With the mantlet and the elevation system out of the way, the next thing to turn my attention to is the installation of the main tube. The tube, like I stated before, is a nice quality piece, but just like what is typically seen on these Armortek kits, there are some machine marks found on the tube section itself. This is something I am going to sand away. Generally, you could use just hand sanding, just go up and down the surfaces, and eventually the barrel sections are going to be totally smooth. On this build here, just like my other builds, I utilize the lathe for this process. The one thing I want to hazard against the lathe is that if you do not know what you're doing, do not try this at home. The lathe method, although it works, it can possibly lead to serious injury, and it's something you definitely don't want to do if you do not have any machine experience. So with that in mind, this bad boy is going to be hooked up into the lathe, and I'm going to touch back with you guys once the surface is fully squared away. Since filming the last scene, the barrel was completely sanded down, and right now it's drying with its coat of primer. While the unit's in dry time, I might as well take this opportunity to take the turret, remount it back onto the model, and patch in the electronics. The model is currently on, as you can clearly see, and the good news is the elevation system works absolutely perfectly. If I go ahead and hit the function on the radio, you should see the mantlet dipping downward, and then it works absolutely flawlessly in the reverse direction as well. As you can see, the elevation works in a nice, fluid, and smooth manner, and the motor doesn't appear to be under any sort of strain, which is a really positive sign. Now, granted, the barrel has not been mounted at this point, which is going to add a little bit of extra weight, so it's going to be interesting to see how the motor is able to operate under those conditions. But right now, for the unit functioning in this type of condition and manner, well, that's, again, a really positive sign. One thing that I do want to point out at this time is that, unlike some of the other Armortek kits that came out in the past where they had that limit switch system, which locks out the direction of the motor when it hits a certain point, This system here does not use that. In its place, it utilizes this little plug that I believe I may have touched upon in this video, but if I didn't, it connects from the motor to the speed controller. And what it does is, apparently it senses when the motor's under strain, and when it does, or I should say when the motor is under strain, some sort of capacitor system shuts the system down and doesn't allow you to continue to operate the motor in that direction. That system is patched in right now. I mean, obviously it's a very simple system to mount. However, from my experience, and same seems to be true with this one here, it doesn't really seem to work. So even if you go to the far extremity, the motor will still continue to function and it doesn't shut off. So this is something to be aware of if you're operating this model. You don't have that nice insurance policy of that limit switch system. So you can possibly overstrain the motor and possibly cause damage. So you have to pay attention to that when you are operating one of these models with the system in place. With the paint fully set on the tube, it was brought back into the shop. And you can see now what it looks like with the sanding completed. Note the surfaces are absolutely smooth, and there are no chatter marks or any sort of tooling marks that are remaining on the surface. On the back portion over here, during the painting process, I went ahead and masked this area up because, again, this needs to ride inside the bushing and it needs to be as slick and as smooth as possible, and any sort of additions like paint or any other type of layers like that are just going to hinder it and cause some problems. So this area was masked up, leaving it in the white that we see right here. With the tube brought closer to the camera, you get to see the surface found on this section. You note how smooth this area is, and this was accomplished with the wet sanding that I was mentioning before, and I used some really fine grit sandpaper in order to do the procedure. This is all done, of course, to cut down as much as possible the amount of friction present on these two locations, which will, again, make the recoil system operate with more efficiency. When the unit does get installed, a little quick smear of grease is going to be added in order to, again, make sure that this piece is as slick as possible. To secure the tube to the model, I need to first hook it up with the flash simulator. The flash simulator, it's a pretty easy install. You basically just stick it into the barrel, and then you fish the remainder of the wires out through the back portion of the tube here, and then they need to fish out through this portion here of the recoil actuating lug. Normally, this is a really simple procedure. However, on this one here, I ran into an interesting quirk. You see, on this flash simulator system, you'll see that on the ends here, we have these very nicely crimped on quick connect jacks. It's a nice feature. It makes the installation go by easier. However, one problem that I ran into on this particular build is with this system here. You will quickly see how you're not going to exactly be able to fish the wires through this system in a really easy way, or actually in any way, because it's basically impossible due to the size of the quick connect jacks. And if you're watching this and saying to yourself, well, John, that's a pretty severe oversight. How can something like that happen? Well, keep in mind that this electronic package is not actually intended for use on this T34 kit. Technically, I'm actually hacking the model for it to use this system. You see, the Armortek T34 was released in 2011 and 2012 timeframe. The electronic package that this model is using, however, is from the 2015 generation. You see, when the T34 kit was designed, the electronic packages of the era did not have these quick connect jacks hooked up to them. You just had a bunch of loose wires emerging from the subloom, which you would then just snake through the pieces that I just mentioned, and then these wires would be matched up with corresponding terminal points found on the recoil system box. In the years that came afterwards, specifically in 2015, Armortek redesigned the system to the setup that we have here, where it connects to a different sort of electronic system. If anyone's curious to see how the older systems would connect, I recommend watching some of the other videos on the channel that discuss one of these older systems in more depth. This would be videos like the Sherman 5C Firefly, the late production Tiger, as well as, well, the King Tiger that I currently have going on right now. I also want to point out that a frequent question that I get from a lot of people out there is, John, can you take an older generation Armortek kit and upgrade the electronics with a newer generation one? And the answer for the longest time was yes, you can. The motors from all the generations all utilize either 24 volt, depending for the main drive, as well as 12 volt for the other accessories like the rotation, elevation, all that stuff. What really changed throughout the generations are some of the modules, how they hook up, and also some of the end connectors like you see on this one here. It is possible to take a vehicle from the first or second generation, like a 2003 or 2004 era Tiger 1, and put 2015 electronics in it. In fact, I actually did that with the recent Tiger 1 video series that I wrapped up a little while ago. If you've watched that video series, you'll see that it's actually pretty easy to cross-platform the two, but you do have to make some changes, mostly to just the end connectors. That changed on some of the motors as well as some of the connections, but other than that, the swap out is relatively easily done. Another question that I get is, is it worth it? And in my opinion, no. If you have a model from an older generation and it's running, you have all the option packs and it's working great, the need to upgrade it to newer electronics is just not necessary in my opinion, nor is it even really worth it. You could just basically keep the thing as is, and if it's running, I don't see why there's any need to upgrade it further. You don't really gain anything from that. The only time that really becomes relevant is if you acquire a kit in the wild or on the secondhand market, and it either is missing the electronics, or you only have some of the electronics fitted, and at that point there, the replacement of the electronics with a newer generation one becomes more viable. Rule of thumb though, if you have the original motors hooked up, you might not want to change those out because the motor mounts have changed throughout the generations, and that's something that could lead to issue. But if you have the original motors hooked up to the model, yeah, the remainder of the electronics are just a simple drop-in replacement. Relatively speaking, of course, because again, the jacks are different here or there. But if you know which wires go where, yeah, the replacement or the upgrade is one that can be done relatively easily. So back to this one here, the way I'm going to go ahead and get the subloom wired up is that I'm going to have to cut each and every one of these jacks off, fish everything through, and then go ahead and resolder them at the opposite end once everything has been fitted. So let's go ahead and cut across when that was already completed. Well, after a few minutes with a soldering iron, you can see the pieces now reconnected. The LEDs are positioned inside of the tube itself. It's a little bit tricky to get on camera, but you can probably see them right here on the corner. When it comes for mounting strobe lights on the inside of these simulators, a lot of people like to position them towards the end, and there are pros and cons to that. Pro is you do get a little bit more flash, admittedly. However, it does become a bit of an eyesore. I personally think it detracts the look from the model when you have this, cluster of LEDs right here, either sticking out or really close to on your model tank barrel. On all of my models, and this includes my 116s, I tend to leave them more towards the inside, which you do get the flash if you see it from the front portion, and you still get, all of that good stuff, but it's not an eyesore or it's not obtrusive, and well, frankly, it doesn't throw off the immersion that you're trying to replicate a real vehicle with it. So the LEDs are held in place with a little dab of silicone on the rear here, right in front of the threads. The brass piece just threaded directly on as per the kit, and then after the connections here were snipped off, the wire was just snaked right through with no problems. The connections were then just, soldered together. I went ahead and heat shrink tubed all of the little connection points, and of course when you do this, you just have to match the colors of the connector and the little bit of wire that's now exposed that's found on the remainder of the subloom. From here, I could go ahead and secure the barrel in its proper location. One other thing I want to mention is that right now you notice the linkage is not yet hooked up. The reason why it's not hooked up at this point is because in order for me to slide it through the mantlet, if the fastener was located for the linkage, it's going to get in the way and I wouldn't be able to slide everything in without the need of having to remove that bolt. So the bolt is going to be mounted once everything is mounted inside of the vehicle. Also, one other thing I want to mention before this gets fitted in place is I went ahead and smeared a thin little layer of grease found right here on the end. The grease obviously is going to be necessary in order to make the piece nice and lubricated, which will assist with the recoil system. But if you'll notice how I mounted it, I only secured it to the end portion over here. When the unit goes into place, it's going to take the extra grease and it's going to smear it on the other locations. The reason why you don't want to put too much grease on it is, well, one, it'll actually inhibit the servo from pulling the unit back. But another reason is that if you have too much grease here, it's going to smear on the front portion here of the tube, which is going to cause problems once the model heads off into paint. So to avoid all that, I just smear just a small amount here on the back so that once it actuates, it'll actually go ahead and smear just the right amount on the appropriate locations. Well, after a few wrench turns later, you can see the system now fully hooked up and mounted. The linkage system is present, as well as that aluminum clevis arm, and of course the kit supplied servo was secured as well. All of the appropriate connections were made. It's a bit of a tangle at the moment. This is going to be ironed out by the next video update. After all the connections were made, I went ahead and attempted to test the system, to see how the system actually functions. Well, at the moment, the sound system was able to be fired up, and I was also able to get the engine noise to throttle up and down. However, like I stated in the video where I discussed the sound system, the unit is not fully calibrated yet, so although I was able to achieve those sounds, they are currently allocated to the incorrect channel. And the other functions, such as the flash and recoil system, are not obtainable currently with the current setup. However, if I grab the tube from the exterior of the model and actuate it manually, you can see that the system operates in a very smooth and effortless manner. However, although I can't exactly test the recoil system, I can at least test the elevation. Like I mentioned before, once you add the tube to the system, it tends to add extra weight and can possibly cause strain on the elevation system. Well, we can go ahead and see if any sort of extra work needs to be done at this point. The model, of course, is on, and let's go ahead and test the unit. Okay, the depress is obviously working very well. But that's the easy part. Let's see if we could go ahead and raise it. Well, seems to be working like a champ to me. One thing I do want to mention briefly is that in the last video, I mentioned that when the turret was built, I needed to make some minor tweaks to the turret rotation motor mount in order to get everything squared away. Well, those tweaks were made and the mount is now permanently attached to the top deck. I kept the exact same fasteners, and the only thing I did was I set the motor to where it's engaging on the turret in both left and right hand directions, and then I carefully loosened each of the fasteners and remounted them, but this time with the addition of a washer as well as a bit of Loctite. Once everything was torqued down in place, the mount was completed. To test it out, the tank is on right now. And the turret rotation works absolutely perfectly. Of course, I did mention this earlier on when I was showing the turret rotating, but here you can see that the mount is now where it needs to be. Obviously, this is a pretty significant step with the model heading more and more closer towards completion. At this point here, the model is actually really close. We're looking at about 65, possibly 70% complete. And if it might not look like that necessarily, but if you see exactly how many parts or lack thereof I have left to install on this build, you'll quickly see that this model is actually really close to the end zone. From this point onward, I'm going to be working on the remainder of some of the extra functions that are going to be added to this model, like the pivoting bow MG, lights, as well as that other secret function that I've yet to mention in more depth. And then after that, well, it's just basically exterior detailing, and we all know once I hit that point, the model tends to roller coaster pretty quickly towards the end zone. Also, just like with the King Tiger video series I have going on right now, this one here, at this point, is actually ready for another test drive. You see, with the addition of the turret now, the model's weight is really going to be more or less where it needs to be. Prior to this, the last time I took this model out for a spin, the turret was not yet assembled, and it was just really an upper and lower hull. Well, with the added weight of the turret, this may change the track tension, and it's something that may or may not need to be adjusted. This is best done, well, churning grass outdoors. Also, even though there are still some more features and details are going to be added to the model from here on, it's not really going to add as much weight to the model where it can possibly throw off the track tension. The added parts, you know, they may be a couple pounds here or there, but considering the turret itself comes in almost 50, maybe 60 pounds, they are not going to have nearly as much effect on the remainder of the model's functionality as opposed to mounting on the turret. This is why, probably within the next week or two, I'm going to be taking this thing out for a spin. But more information on that, of course, is going to be discussed in the next video or two updates. And with that, that wraps up this project update video for this 1/6 scale Armortek radio-controlled Russian T34 85 tank. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel, where it's a great way to keep up to date on new posted content, being 1/6 scale project update videos like this one over here, or the other smaller scale project update videos that frequently get posted to this channel. Another way to keep in the loop of new posted content is by liking us on Facebook. There, I have more photographs of this particular build that have been posted since the project start, as well as the other smaller and larger scale builds that have been seen on this channel in the past. Furthermore, don't forget to swing by eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/16 and 1/6 scale builds and detail components. Thanks again. Looking forward to seeing you all again on the next one. Take care.